You have written about Kris Kobach, who, I mean, I sort of knew a little bit about him before I read your piece, but after reading your piece, I sort of feel he might be one of the creepiest people who are in our national politics right now. I mean, like a guy like Jeff Sessions, he's a liar. He may be a little bit corrupt, and he's a horrible, I think, racist. But he's sort of one-dimensional in that way. Kris Kobach seems to be multi-dimensional in his creepy and horrificness.
Well, I think what I wanted people to understand is he really is the architect of Trumpism, to the extent that there is any ideology behind Donald Trump. He is the guy who has promulgated these things. So the idea, that when Trump came out and said, Mexicans are rapists and murderers, and we're going to build a wall and do all of those things, Kobach was the guy who, before Trump ever came on the scene, was trying to restrict immigration. And when Trump said that 3 to 5 million people had voted illegally, Kobach was the guy who was in his ear saying that voter fraud by non-citizens was rampant, even though there was no evidence of any of this kind of stuff. So I really wanted to talk about this intellectual movement that has come behind the president, that to restrict voting, to restrict immigration, to try to preserve a shrinking white majority, and say, there are real people behind this. It's easy to sort of dismiss Trump, but there are real people behind this that have spent a lot of time getting to this position where someone like Donald Trump could be elected president, where we could have these kind of restrictive policies put in place. And even though Kris Kobach is just a Secretary of State, he's enormously powerful in that position, and his influence really can be seen all over the place, but particularly in the Trump era.
It's fascinating because, it's as if Trump basically takes the top line, right? And you have laid out all of the infrastructure, all of the scaffolding, all of the floors beneath the sort of the penthouse that Donald Trump adopted when he came down the escalator stairs. And when you read this stuff about Kobach, it reminded me of a caller that we had very early on who was an adamant Trump supporter, and his biggest issue was this whole notion that, and this is back in, July of 2015, his biggest issue was the idea that there were millions of immigrants, of undocumented immigrants who were voting in elections, local elections, national elections, and this was his animating point. And really, to a large extent, there's really not a lot else about sort of Trumpism that still remains intact, right? I mean, when we talk about all of the things that Trump had sort of implied that he was interested in and promised, none of it withstood even the slightest bit of I guess, sausage making in Washington, except for the anti-immigrant and the sort of, I guess, this through line that, there's a lot of illegal people voting. So let's start with BirthLink. What is BirthLink?
Well, I think this is a little obscure. I think we should start with the fact, Kansas passed this law to require proof of citizenship to vote. So basically, well before Trump had started talking about, millions of people voting illegally, this was something that Kris Kobach, who was Secretary of State of Kansas, was talking about very aggressively. He said that a registration by aliens was pervasive, and that Kansas needed to pass a law requiring proof of citizenship for voter registration to combat this. And now proof of citizenship for voter registration means you have to show in Kansas a birth certificate, a passport, or naturalization papers to be able to register to vote. Well, the problem in Kansas and elsewhere is that people don't carry those documents on them. This isn't like voter ID where you have to show a driver's license to register, and 90% of people have a driver's license. This is more specific documentation. Most people don't carry a passport around with them. Most people
don't have a passport.
Exactly. Only 7% of Americans even have a passport. Most people don't know where their birth certificates are. Most people don't know where their naturalization papers are. And then to have to bring them with them when they register to vote is really burdensome. So what we've seen in Kansas is that 1 in 7 people who tried to register to vote after 2013 when this law into effect were blocked from registering, which is just an enormous number. I mean, imagine if you have 7 people in line to register to vote and 1 out of 7 of them can't register. That's what's happened in Kansas. So what I tried to show in this piece was both, A, the lack of evidence that's presented to justify claims of voter fraud, but number 2, the ramifications of policies to make it harder to vote. Because the whole reason that politicians like Kris Kobach and Donald Trump talk about voter fraud is because they want to put in place policies like these policies, proof of citizenship, which in the case of Kansas basically froze the electorate because they made it so hard to register voters that you had a situation where tens of thousands of people were blocked from registering. And because they were people that were registering for the first time, they were disproportionately younger. They were disproportionately less likely to be Republicans. They were more likely to be lower income or people of color. So it froze the Republican electorate in place in that state.
And I think even just, look, you got to pay an extra $40 to get the birth certificate. You got to pay X or Y for a passport, and if you're not traveling out of the country, you wouldn't get that. So you right there, you're already, and the idea that you would sort of like, okay, I'm going to go register to vote, but I need a month or 3 weeks or 2 weeks lag time to go and petition the hospital to get a copy of my birth certificate, et cetera, et cetera. This, I think you could probably rather easily also say that it disproportionately hits people living in poverty as well. But let's start with sort of Kris Kobach's, I guess, intellectual development, starting at the Harvard Center for International Affairs. I mean, did Kobach go to Harvard? Is that how did he get how did he become a protege of Professor Samuel Huntington? And who is Huntington?
So this was interesting because, Kobach has degrees from Harvard, Oxford, and Yale. So he's obviously a very smart guy. And one thing I wondered is, how could a guy who has all these degrees from very liberal institutions be so conservative, particularly on issues like immigration, when he was a pretty worldly guy who was clearly exposed to other cultures? And one thing I realized is that when he went to Harvard as an undergrad, he was a protege of a very well-known professor, Samuel Huntington, who had very, very extreme views when it came to race. Huntington worked in the National Security Council under Jimmy Carter, but he wasn't really a Democrat, or if he was a very old school Democrat. He pioneered this idea of a clash of civilizations between Islam in the West, and that book became very, very famous. But then he wrote this book in 2004 called Who Are We? That was about immigration. And he said a lot of really alarming things. He denounced what he called the Hispanicization of the U.S. He said that Mexican Americans were contemptuous of American culture, that they didn't identify with the United States, all of these really anti-immigrant, anti-Latino things. And then, I went back and looked at some of his writing from the 1970s and the 1980s, and I realized that Huntington had advised apartheid South African government, that he had written this article for the Trilateral Commission that talked about how the U.S. had too much democracy, that if you extended democracy, in his words, to the blacks, it would overwhelm the political system. And this was Kris Kobach's lead advisor at Harvard, and it struck me that, granted, that this was only when Kobach was an undergrad, but so much of what Huntington was talking about over the years from the 1970s onwards seems to have shaped Kobach's views both on immigration and on this view that maybe broad-based democracy isn't so great of a thing.
I just want to say kudos to Harvard for having such an open mind about their faculty who introduced this idea that you don't want to give too much power to the blacks when they vote. Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos